Our lesson today is probing the future. And of course, everyone wishes they could know the future, right? I think right now, with all the unrest in the world and the current world events that we see from day to day, if there was a way to foretell the future, almost everyone would want to avail themselves of that. Everyone wants to know what is ahead. It seems like most people realize that we're kind of on the cusp of something, aren't we? And that something is about to happen. The question is, how do we go about this? How about crystal balls and mediums and seances? Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that seems like a distant television show that I saw sometime in the past, and it seems quite silly. But I got news for you. These things are very real, and they're very alive in the world today. They have not gone away. It's not just a fictional story that you hear about. And this picture represents the pendulums and the crystals and the different divinations that people believe in out there. And this is an old one, but it's still around. Tarot cards. And, the people will read the cards. Some of the mediums will read the palms. And they believe that they can tell the future by looking at the lines that are in your palm. Some believe that taxiography. You know what he's doing? Reading tea leaves. Ever heard of that? And then a very, very popular one is astrology. A lot of people believe that you can tell the future by reading the stars. Big difference between astrology and astronomy, right? Amen. One is the science that is in the stars. The other is anything but science. Joshua, maybe this is a better picture. Does that look familiar? Guess what it is? It's the zodiac. So, it's the same kind of thing. And probably some of you remember this thing. It is still alive and well, and I had to remind myself of that because I'm so far removed from those kind of things. But when I say, do you know what this is? You say Ouija board, but my question's deeper than that. Is it a child's game? Is it a fortune-telling device? If you could see, I don't know if you can see it, but that says Ouija, mystifying oracle up there. Or is it an occultic device? And I guess D would be all of the above, okay? But these things are sold in stores as essentially a child's game. And there's another interesting label, and I wanted to make sure you saw this one. If you blow it up, down at the bottom it says Parker Brothers, which is a game, a toy company. But it says Parker Brothers Incorporated, Salem, Massachusetts. And I thought that was interesting. Do you know what Salem, Massachusetts is famous for? Witchcraft and witch hunts. But you have to have witchcraft, I guess, in order to have those witch hunts, don't you? So I just thought that was interesting. And I know I'm getting silly with this, but we had one when I was a kid that's still around. It's called the Magic 8-Ball. And it always knows the right answers, right? Because that's the reason why it has this one here. Reply hazy. Try again later. Yeah. And that is the nature. It's interesting you bring up fortune cookies, because if you look up the zodiac in the newspaper, they'll give you these forecasts for your, personal benefit. And we all know how that works. They're so vague that, any one of the things will fit pretty much everybody.
Nostradamus.
Yeah. And there's a long list of these things in our world, isn't there? There absolutely is. Now, I don't know if they still do this or not, but when I was a kid, this was a big one. These tabloids like the National Enquirer, every year around New Year's, they would come out with the predictions for the next year. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a lady by the name of Jean Dixon that was world famous for this stuff. And I wanted to look up and see how accurate that Jean Dixon was in all her years of predicting, because I remember hearing Joe Cruz use her as an example one time. It was interesting. I looked at several websites, but there was one man who said, you've got a 50-50 shot on anything. Either it does happen or it doesn't. And what they said about Jean Dixon was her favorite words were could, may, probably, and might. If you go back and look at some of these things, and I remember years ago when I first started working at Kroger, I was on the night crew, and night crew people are a different bunch, I promise you. And, we're doing a fairly mundane job, and so we would take our breaks, and as we passed by the registers, everybody would get a magazine, a different magazine. And each person would go through these magazines, and we would pick out these funny stories, and we would just share them back and forth, But I remember these prediction issues. And they would say things like, there will be an earthquake in Latin America. You know what? Lots of earthquakes in Latin America every single year. There's no such thing as a year without them, is there? Woody Allen will be in the news. Well, that's a prediction, right? How about a major fire will destroy homes in California? The price of automobiles will rise this year.
Hey, you can do this. You can be on it.
Seriously, the guy wrote, no one would be surprised if all these predictions were fulfilled by Friday. Yeah. Okay? They're not really predictions, are they? But they say that on her best year ever, Jean Dixon got about 40% of her predictions correct. And I think that's fairly phenomenal, even in a 50-50 shooting match. But there were many years when her accuracy was down around 15%. But Jean Dixon claimed that her information came from God. But folks, how can it be that God only gets 40% right?
15 of that.
Because you know what that means?
60 wrong.
That means he got 60% wrong, folks. And I'm not willing to pin that on God.
Yeah.
The test of a true prophet is they have to be right 100% of the time, don't they? She claimed to be a prophet of God, and she has a lot of things written about the Bible and the last day events. But folks, is that a safe place to get your information from? Absolutely not. We want to go to that Bible, just like we've been doing for all of the other doctrines that we've been talking about, the studies that we've been doing together. Is there a source for understanding the future where the answers are 100% correct? And folks, the answer is yes. The Bible has a lot to say about the future. And God has been so wonderful and so gracious to provide a lot of information about the future to us. And, a lot of the future predictions of the Bible is such an old book, that a lot of the future predictions of the Bible have already come true. They're no longer future. They're now in the past. And we can see that the Bible knew ahead of time and got things right. But folks, there's still a lot of these prophecies that tell us about the future that is yet to come, and even the end of days here on planet Earth. So we're going to spend a few studies together studying to try to learn about this last day vital, important information. I want to start with Isaiah 45 and verse 11. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and His Maker, ask me of things to come." You know, with all our amazing technology, folks, we can hardly predict the temperature for the next day. Right? I mean, they try, and they get pretty close, but they certainly don't get it right all the time, whether it's going to rain or whether it's not going to rain. And so we certainly don't have any idea about the future. But folks, if we turn to God, and He knows the beginning from the end, and He's given us this information in His Word, we can have a good understanding of what is about to happen in our world. Isaiah 41 verse 22, "Let them bring them forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come." This is God through the prophet Isaiah saying, okay, let your prophets tell us. Let the astrologers and the soothsayers, let them tell us what's really going to happen in the future. It's sarcastic. It's taunting in nature because they do not know the end from the beginning. They don't know what's coming in the future. It's not really fortune telling, but one really good indicator of the future is called the past. And you know, there's an awful lot of things that we can learn from our past, and we can have a fairly good idea just from that what's coming in the future. And that's not a bad thing. You know, there's some old sayings like, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed, it says, to repeat it. In other words, if you don't learn from your mistakes, what are you going to do? You're going to keep making mistakes, aren't you? But it's true of world events. It's true of this thing we call history. God is really promising to share unique things about the future with His people. And look what it says in Isaiah 47, verse 13. "Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee." Just as we see today, folks, there have always been these kind of fortune-telling fakers, haven't there? Notice what the Bible says about them. Let them save you from the things that are about to come upon you. And also, look at verse 14. It says, "Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor a fire to sit before." Now, we use that Bible verse to talk about the state of the dead a lot of times. But who is it that's specifically being talked about here? It was those astrologers and stargazers and soothsayers and prognosticators and all of those things. And so the sources of information that these have are not reliable. And if they have any power at all, folks, it's because the majority of them are fakers and con artists. But if they have any power at all, where do you think they get it from? Is there supernatural power in our world that does not come from God? Yes, there absolutely is. So, but if they're only right 15% of the time, they're probably just fakers, right? But if they do a lot better than that, I would say they are probably getting help from a supernatural power. But whose power? Proverbs 27:1 says, Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. Don't boast for tomorrow, because tomorrow's not even guaranteed to us, is it? But certainly we don't know what it is that's going to happen. Folks, we just have to admit, without God's help, we cannot know what the future holds. But I want you to consider some very awesome Bible verses. Again, notice a lot of these are Isaiah, aren't they? Isaiah 44, verse 6. Thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, and I am the last, and beside me there is no God. And in the very next verse, verse 7 says, And who as I shall call and shall declare it, and set it in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people, and the things that are coming and shall come, let them show unto them. Folks, God's the only one that can do this. And so he says to the soothsayers and the prognosticators, come on, you tell us. Because they can't. They don't know what the future holds. Isaiah 46:9, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me. And verse 10 says, declaring the end from the beginning. What is it that makes God unique?
He knows the end from the beginning.
Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Folks, we're going to see in our lessons together just how the events are described by God as an open book. In other words, a lot of these mysteries that perplex the people in the world, if we study the Scriptures, they're common knowledge to Christians. But again, I want us to see what the Bible says about these fortune tellers. Isaiah 8:19, and when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God for the living to the dead? Another one of these is to communicate with the dead. And we've already had a study where we talked about this. We studied about spiritualism, didn't we? Not only is it useless to go to these mediums, but it's forbidden by God because it's dangerous. Why does God forbid us from going to these? Listen, if we place ourselves before these practitioners, we are placing ourselves on the devil's ground, right? So if we're placing ourselves on the devil's ground, if we're putting ourselves before the devil, what happens to us? I mean, he's ready, willing, and able to take control of us and to fool us and everything else, isn't he? And of course, Amos 3:7. I love this Bible verse. It says, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secrets unto his servants, the prophets. It says God doesn't do anything that he doesn't reveal his secrets through the prophets. What an awesome promise this is to those of us who are living in the last days especially. Folks, God knows the end from the beginning. And he is very willing to share this knowledge with you and I. Now, beginning next time, we're going to study the wonderful prophecies in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel's image. And so that's for next week, and I don't want to really get ahead of myself here, but I do want to show you just a little statement from Daniel chapter 2. Because the king had had a dream, and none of the wise men or the astrologers could help him, could make sense out of it and tell him about the dream. And this is what it says. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? I think there ought to be a question mark there. Because I think Daniel's saying, well, wait a minute, you've got all the, supposedly the world's smartest men, all the people with the power are all around you. and they can't help you. Look what it says in the next verse. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And he goes on. And like I said, this will be our next lesson. We're going to study about these important things that are shared for us there in Daniel chapter 2. But this story tells us about Nebuchadnezzar trusting in his wise men and astrologers and magicians and soothsayers, but they just couldn't do a thing for him. They didn't have any real power on their own, did they? But God could, and He did, and through Daniel his prophet, he tells us many important messages about the future. But see what it says there? There is a God in heaven, and He reveals the secrets to His people. There is a true God in heaven. Amen? All these other gods are false. And folks, this is the formula that we all must follow if we would know the future. New Testament Bible verse, 2 Peter 1:19 says, we have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn, and the day star arise in your hearts. Now, I think this is a really interesting Bible verse. It shows us, is there prophecy in New Testament times? Is prophecy still alive and well? Yes, it is. God still has messages, and I submit to you the most important messages of all in the Bible are for God's last day people. But answer me this. Who is the day star that would arise in our hearts? Now, it's not always plain here, but if you think about it, folks, the day star here, specifically it says the dawning of the day. And answer me this question. What is the dawning of the day called? That's one. Say it louder. The dawning of the day is what we call morning, isn't it? And it says morning. Who is the morning star? That's Jesus, isn't it? In two other scriptures, and by the way, very prophetic scriptures, Revelation 2:28 and Revelation 22, verse 16, Jesus is referred to as the bright and morning star. So it doesn't come across in exactly the same way here, but it really is here. Look at what it says. As a light that shineth in a dark place. That'd be bright, wouldn't it? And the dawning day star, that would be the morning star, wouldn't it? And Peter connects a sure word of prophecy with this. And folks, the book of Revelation is as prophetic as it gets. It's all about foretelling the future to God's people. Deuteronomy 28 verse 63 says, it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught, and you shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. Now you remember, or at least I think most of you will remember, that Deuteronomy 28 is what I call the if chapter. The word if is used several times in this chapter, and in the first half of the chapter, it tells what would happen to the children of Israel if they are obedient to the Lord's instructions and His commandments. They are going to be made a great people. They're going to be brought together to be a great nation. But the second half of that chapter tells that if they are disobedient, they're going to be cursed. And what is the specific curse that is to happen to them? Well, it's just the opposite of the blessing. The blessing, they're going to be brought together to build a great nation. But if they're disobedient, what happens? They're torn apart. They're scattered apart. Now look at what it says in verse 64. The Lord shall scatter thee among all the people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. The wood and stone are the actual gods that they were going to worship. How strange. Verse 65. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. Folks, the history of the children of Israel is very plain. When they were obedient, they were blessed. And I mean blessed above every nation in the world. But unfortunately, they were not obedient most of the time. And their history shows that the words prophesied about them in Deuteronomy 28 have been fulfilled to a T, haven't they? They have been scattered among the nations of the world, and for most of their history they have been ruled over by other nations as opposed to ruling themselves. Later in verse 37, or actually it was before that, but in verse 37 it says, And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. They're going to become an astonishment. What does that mean? What is it telling us about here?
Stand out. Used to be, what might have been.
Yeah, they would stand out amongst the peoples of the world. Are they going to be lesser than the other peoples, or are they going to be greater?
In this context, lesser. Byword.
Well, it's interesting. What you do is you look, which part of the chapter is this given in? And then it's easy to tell, isn't it? If they're obedient, what happens to them?
Greater.
They're going to be greater. They're going to be blessed. But if they're disobedient, and that's really what it's talking about here, they're going to be scattered.
We have history to prove it.
Oh, absolutely. A very firm history that proves this, don't we? And folks, you just think about the terrible persecutions during World War II. I mean, that really stands out to us as probably the greatest in the history of the world. But folks, the history of that people has been one of almost continual persecution at the hands of these other nations of the world. Very few times that's not the case. And you think about what happened with World War II. And what about even today? I wasn't aware of it, but we've got violence that's going on all over our country right now against the Jews. So even in our day, there's still controversy over this hatred for the Jews.
Burning their synagogues.
Yeah, bombing and burning their synagogues. That's exactly right. You know, Jesus prophesied about that very thing in Luke 21, verse 24, And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, Luke 21 is the parallel chapter to Matthew 24. They're both giving basically, two different accounts of the same information. And here Jesus tells us of this same persecution and scattering among the nations that we just have been reading about. But he also tells of how their precious city would fall to the Gentiles and be trodden down. And folks, that city has indeed been captured more times and by more different peoples than we could probably even list here. But a very famous one happened shortly after this prophecy was made by Jesus in the year 70 A.D.
Well, John, the rock is right there where the temple should be.
That's right. Well, I mean, there's a whole list of different nations in antiquity that took that city over, but just the ones that we know about, the ones that are fighting over it today, you've got the Catholics, you've got the Protestants, you've got the Jews, and you've got the Muslims. They're all fighting over this peace. And do you think a single one of them is satisfied about it? About their situation with it? I don't. So this is kind of like a treasure that just got stole. Well, in that other chapter, Matthew 24, the disciples are taking Jesus around, and they're kind of bragging, and they're showing off the buildings of the temple there in verse 1. And in verse 2 it says, "And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things?" He's pointing to the buildings of the temple. And he says, "I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So he not only says that the city is going to be trampled underfoot now, but he makes an amazing prediction about the stones that make up the building and how they would be torn apart and not be sitting one upon another. And as is very often the case with Bible prophecies, at the moment that they're made, they just seem unbelievable. They're just too fantastic to believe. And I want to show you a picture to illustrate this. This is, it says, the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. Do you see the stone that the man is leaning up against? The second stone, there's a stone, there's a stone, there's a stone. But that one stone right there is the same piece of stone from right here all the way to the end. And they say that is 30 feet. And it looks to be probably about 4 foot tall. And it must have some depth to it as well. Now, not all of the stones are this big. These are foundational stones that hold up the rest of the building. But it certainly shows us how massive the structure would have been. Now, this is right next door to this temple building that we're actually talking about. It makes the prophecy seem pretty far-fetched, doesn't it? These stones are so big, they're so heavy, and they're cut so perfectly that they did not even use mortar to put them together. Pretty amazing. But guess what? You want to see a picture of the temple today? This is what you find along Herodian Street next to the temple buildings, where the Romans cast down the stones all around the temple. This happened in 70 A.D. when the Romans overtook and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They burned the temple so that much of the gold that was in there melted down and ran into the cracks between the stones, the great stones. And even though they were going against their orders, they were ordered not to tear down the building, but greed took over, and the soldiers tore down the great stones to get to the gold that was in between the cracks of the stones. Just like Jesus said. Couldn't happen. No way that could happen, Jesus. What are you talking about? But it did. It's amazing, isn't it? And there's another picture. Anybody want to guess what that is? Say it louder. Yeah. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We do not know exactly what they look like. We don't have benefit of pictures. We only have literary descriptions to go by. And there are hundreds of artist conceptions that you can find pictures for in books and online. There's all kinds of pictures for you to look at and to consider. And I have probably chosen the worst picture that you could possibly ever find. It's a really old picture, and you can see that it's deteriorated. All the spots, paint is coming apart. But there's a reason why I chose this picture. You see, King Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens in 580 BC for his wife. He had married Amytis, the daughter of a Median king called Astyages, and this was a contracted marriage for the benefit of the politics between the two nations rather than for love between the two that were going to be married. And Nebuchadnezzar was trying very, very hard to make this wife happy. But it was not an easy task because she was very homesick. You see, she was from the mountains where there was plenty of water and vegetation, and her new home was in the desert, basically. I mean, they were on the river. You can see the Euphrates River there, but everything around there was very flat and very dry. And I think this picture does the best job of making gardens appear to be what the history books tell us is that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to build her a lush mountain. That's what the Hanging Gardens were all about. They were supposed to look like a beautiful green mountain. And they were supposed to make, they were supposed to make his bride happy. Well, we call this one of the wonders of the ancient world, the seven wonders. But it's interesting. The Bible said in Jeremiah 50, verse 39, "Therefore the wild beast of the desert with the wild beast of the islands shall dwell there, and the owls shall dwell therein, and it shall be no more inhabited forever, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation." Actually, there's two whole chapters in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 50 and 51, that tell us about Babylon and this curse that was placed upon it. One of the wonders of the world, the city was so filled with wickedness and pride that God chose to use it as a prophetic illustration of the end-time judgment and destruction of the world. Look at what it says in verse 40. "God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and the neighbor cities thereof, saith the Lord. So shall no man abide there, neither shall any son of man dwell therein." What this verse is saying, that just as God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, guess what? This is going to be pretty much destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. But he did not rain down fire out of heaven, did he? And what do you think they thought about this prophecy when it was first made? I mean, it's just no possible. This is the greatest place in the entire world. It sits right on the Euphrates River. There's plenty of water. And you know, you look at these drawings and it's amazing. They were very smart. They diverted water from the river, and there was water flowing up and down the streets of the city to keep all of this beautiful vegetation and all of these beautiful flowers. What an amazing prophecy about such an apparently wonderful place. And it just seemed impossible. There's nothing bad could ever happen to Babylon. Want to see a picture of Babylon today? That's a mess. Everything you're looking at there in the foreground up until the last few inches of that picture, everything you're looking at there was man-made. These aren't rocks out in the desert. These are walls and things that have been just destroyed and made a mess of. Few unclean animals. The Bible said there would be lizards and owls, and it's funny, everything he named were unclean. And guess what? That's all that lives there today. Now, very interesting to this, because we're talking about prophecy. Now, the reason I bring these up, the prophecy about Israel and the prophecy about Babylon, is that those have already been fulfilled, just like the Bible said they would. And so what does that do for our courage in studying the remaining prophecies in the Bible? If everything the Bible says has come true, then we can have great faith in what is about to happen in our world. But I want you to see in Revelation chapter 18, this is almost the very end of the Bible, isn't it? It says, he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, that is literally true, but it's not written in the book of Revelation for its literal truthfulness. God has taken this piece of history and He's using it for an illustration about the end times, isn't He? And so it'll be really interesting. We're going to study about this very thing as we go forward. But I just think it's truly fascinating that where we stand in the history of the world, many of the prophecies of the Bible have already come to pass. There's just a handful that are yet future. And folks, if God said it and it happened, and God says it now, will it happen?
Amen.
Absolutely, it will. In 1 Thessalonians 5:20 it says, despise not prophesying. Now, I've told you a few times, if you look that word despise up in the Strong's Concordance, it doesn't mean that you hate something. It actually means that you ignore it. You pretty much are complacent about this thing. And so when it says despise not prophesying, we're not describing somebody that would be hateful toward the prophecies, but somebody that just doesn't care. Doesn't see the value in looking into these things and into studying these things. But folks, God's counsel to us is don't ignore the prophecies, right? Do we need to study these things? Yes, we absolutely do. But it's really interesting to me because many professed Christians today do not want to have anything to do with the book of Revelation. Yeah, they think it's a sealed book. They think it's a closed book. Listen, the name Revelation means revealing. It doesn't mean it's sealed up and closed and hidden, does it? Folks just aren't interested hardly at all in the book of Revelation. But folks, these prophecies contain vital information for those of us who will be living at the very end of time. And we must acquaint ourselves with these important messages. In Revelation 1:3, it says, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. I want you to notice three important things here. The blessing comes to those who do what? Read. But is it enough simply to read the prophecies? No, we have to hear the words of the prophecy. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean sit and listen to a preacher tell about it? Not really.
Means to comprehend.
Means to comprehend. You're right, Rodney. So we have to read it, but we have to read it with enough interest and enough energy that we find out, what does this really mean? Does everything written in the Bible just lay open for our understanding, or do we sometimes have to dig? You know, the Bible uses the illustration of digging for the truth like you're digging for a treasure.
Amen.
Isn't that right? But is it enough to read and understand? There's one more important thing there. We have to keep those things that are written therein.
Practice.
We have to practice it, don't we?
Right.
Kind of like the old saying, practice what you preach, right?
Right.
It's not as, I mean, it is important what we preach, folks, but it's not as important what we preach as it is what we practice.
When
True?
Practice speaks louder.
Actions are louder than words, aren't they? That's exactly right. Not enough just to read, not enough to even read and understand the prophecies, but folks, we must be ready to live according to the words of this prophecy. Because, according to that last line there, if you'll notice, the time is at hand. These things are going to be taking place very soon and all around us, and this information is what is going to lead us through this maze of trouble in these last days. And folks, that is why the Bible says in Isaiah 42 verse 9, "Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare before they spring forth. I tell you of them." There are many Bible prophecies that have already come to pass. And if we see the accuracy of those Bible prophecies, it gives us courage to believe in the prophecies that are yet to come. But that's what Isaiah is saying here. It says God will tell us many important things before they come to pass. And folks, that's what we need. So we look forward to studying many wonderful prophecies together. And next week we're going to begin, as I said, with Daniel's image. And man, what a really awesome prophecy and message that there is in Daniel 2.